afternoon to you. The Progressive Health Forum, as well as the South African Medical Association, have welcomed the lifting of the suspension of Dr Tim de Maayer, who wrote an open letter published by Daily Maverick about conditions at the Rahima Moosa Mother and Child Hospital. However, de Maayer, it now appears, will still face disciplinary action. Before we speak to the Progressive Health Forum's Dr Aslam Dasoo, let's take a quick look at some of the key extracts from Dr de Maayer's impassioned letter. Addressing the Gauteng Health Department and hospital management, de Maayer asked the Gauteng Health officials and management how they sleep at night, knowing of the conditions at the hospital. He cited some examples of how staff were unable to provide care for the tiny patients in the neonatal wards, saying they sometimes had to use the torch on their mobile phones at night. He also pointed out he was not raising the issues for the first time. Staff had appealed for help several times in the past. He also said that struggle icons would be turning in their graves if they could see the conditions at the health facilities that now bear their names. Nonetheless, he said, staff would continue to care for their tiny patients. Well, what happened last week was that Dr de Maayer was suspended for the publication of that letter. Then, in just 24 hours after a huge outcry, there was a meeting involving himself, we understand the hospital CEO, and the Gauteng Health MEC. After that, the Gauteng Health Department issued a statement in which they said that the issue had been resolved amicably. Now, we understand he is facing some disciplinary action again. Dr Aslam Dasoo is from the Progressive Health Forum. He's the convener there. Dr Dasoo, good afternoon to you. What's now happened to Dr de Maayer?
Good afternoon, Stephen. Thank you for inviting me. There has been some development since we issued our statement yesterday, and it will help if I can discuss this matter in two related parts. The first is the one that you've introduced, the rather unfortunate series of events that transpired, beginning, in fact, with Dr de Maayer and colleagues making numerous complaints over the years and months leading up to this, about the lack of provisioning in the hospital that was actually causing mortality and morbidity among children. These complaints got nowhere. They went through the correct channels and they were, just ignored. And I think in exasperation, he wrote his letter, his very heartfelt letter. And in doing that, I must say that he didn't only expose the rot at Rahima Moosa. He channeled the thoughts of thousands of health workers who are stuck in public health facilities run by the Gauteng Department of Health that are atrocious beyond words. And it's something that's not new. We've come up against this, we've spoken out against it, many others have. But the situation that followed was very unfortunate, to the extent that when they suspended him, neither the head of department of the Gauteng Department of Health nor the Premier knew this would be happening. And of course, it caused the outcry that it was primed to do. And when he was reinstated, our relief was quite short-lived when we heard that his reinstatement was conditional, that he would be issued with a warning letter by his superior, who was instructed to issue that letter. And that is Professor Ashraf Kavadia, the head of pediatrics there. But Professor Kavadia, being a member of faculty, demurred. He refused. And I believe the faculty is now involved.
So what action then is happening now? Who's brought this? I mean, why would they be doing it? Why is all of this happening?
Yes, look, it sounds like a very vindictive, petty, bureaucratic action, because his letter obviously stung. And they had to demonstrate a measure of punitive punishment here. Now, and that's really the problem. It's the second part that I spoke about. That part is about how the administrative regime is organized. This case mirrors cases that come out of the 1980s as well. The issues about curbing the rights of doctors, nurses, and other health professionals to speak out when the conditions under which they're working violates their ethical frameworks and their professional remits, which trump bureaucratic rules every time. And the previous regime, we knew, had a real incentive to stifle dissent. This regime has no such excuse. at all. But yet we find that the bureaucracy, which has been a dismal failure, as we can tell, it's quite self-evident, will brook no objection to how it runs things. And here's a perfect example. So we're seeing a reprise of what happened in the old days under apartheid rules happening here. And this must come to an end. So we have heard that the Faculty of Health Sciences and Professor Shabir Mahdi is on record as saying they have informed the Gauteng Department of Health that these doctors are under joint employment, that is of the medical school and of the Gauteng Department of Health. They will not be issuing him with any letter of warning because Professor Kavadia, of course, is a member of the faculty, and the faculty is blankly refusing to issue any letter of warning. They have indicated this to the head of department as well as to the Director General, the Deputy Director General in charge of HR, who has been insisting on this. Now, you know, Stephen, what we're dealing with here is our entire public health system under such severe duress because of its lackluster management and its severe deficit in provisioning. And we are now facing a defensiveness on the side of the administration that is responsible for that. There's really only one winner in this, and that must be the ethical remit of the doctors and the nurses and the health workers, because the patient's interests come first, above the interests of bureaucrats. And so I think that it's very clear from the reaction we are seeing across the board that what Dr. De Maayer did is completely supported, and that it is not regarded as having transgressed any rule of any consequence, except in the minds of bureaucrats. So we are waiting to see what the department is now going to do. Will they issue a letter of warning? We don't know. But we are determined that if they were to harass health workers any further, we will act against them. And there's lots of reason to do so, because the rules they are using, we are strongly advised, are unconstitutional.
Dr. Dasoo, look, I don't for a moment want to take the side, well, I do, but I don't want to take the side of the Gauteng Health Department in this. But I would imagine that there's an employment contract, and most employment contracts say you're actually not allowed to talk about what happens at work. You know, some things are sort of behind the curtain, as it were. Could De Maayer technically have broken his contract? And let me just stress, I would absolutely accept the moral argument, particularly as a doctor, that he has a duty to speak out. I would also imagine that Wits University would also argue, I think correctly perhaps, that there's academic freedom involved here too. But the lawyers, you know what the lawyers can be like, Dr. Dasoo. I mean, could they argue that he's broken his contract?
They might, you know, and that's up to them. What we have been advised and what we know from the past, and what we all know, Stephen, you know, I know, we have a right to freedom of speech, all of us. And that where there is a curb on that right, there must be reasonable grounds for those curbs. There are no reasonable grounds when people follow the routes that are prescribed to bring up issues, raise the complaints, ask for help, and nothing happens. And now you're dealing with having to break your oath, your ethical duties, your professional remit. And I think many would choose to actually leave the system. And they are doing it in droves because of this. And here Dr. De Maayer, who is a committed public health specialist, and with a rare specialty on top of that, you know, finally, you know, just refusing to take this anymore, and spoke out. And I think, again, let me reference the fact that he is channeling the feeling of thousands. The Gauteng Department of Health is on a hiding to nothing if they persist with this. The second thing they must do, and that's up to the Gauteng provincial government, to institute an inquiry into this miserable set of actions that they took. Who authorized the CEO to issue the letter of suspension? Why was she allowed to extract an apology directly from Dr. De Maayer for sending out a text where he thanked people for supporting him? Nothing more than that. I saw that text. So now we're dealing here with a vindictiveness that's at a personal level, and the bureaucrats are afraid that if they let this go, other healthcare workers are going to speak out. We hope they do, because that's going to be the way to change the administrative regime. And when you change the administrative regime, Stephen, you're not only protecting the rights of people, you're improving the chances of getting your public health facilities functional again. So this is a virtuous cycle that we must stimulate at this point.
There's another issue here, which is that you would want someone who looks after children to be able to concentrate just on doing that, especially someone with a rare specialty, as you said, Dr. De Maayer has. I would also want the CEO of the Rahima Moosa Hospital to be concentrating solely on running her hospital, because it needs so much energy. Here we are, having a huge fight.
Exactly. And again, it's how the administration is organized. The CEO is the the far end of the administration that sits in head office. So she is an appendage of that administration. In other words, whatever happens on the ground is the will of the administration, rather than the local conditions that require the actions of clinicians and local administrators to manage the facility. It's a highly complex system, as you know, and you know, you can't be messing around with that remote control, especially by people who actually don't know how health systems work. So this has been, I think, the underlying issue. On top of that, we have a CEO who has behaved erratically in the past. Just a month or two ago, when pregnant women were found to be sleeping on the floor of the casualty, waiting for beds, she implied quite categorically that they were paid to stage this whole thing, to have their photographs taken and video taken of them in order to embarrass her, that in fact there are beds. Now that is self-evidently not true. So I think what needs to happen is an inquiry into her fitness to hold this position. And by extension, it will be a signal to all other CEOs that their first responsibility is to the facility, not to head office. And the facility means the population of health workers in that facility and the patients and the communities the facilities serve. And I think anything other than that will see us continue down this downward spiral of losing staff, the public sector diminishing access, which it's constitutionally obliged to provide as a result. So if we were to succeed, and I think the government needs to think carefully about this, it's in its own interests. If we were to succeed in reimagining the administrative regime, of course there's a head office, of course there's a department. It is there to provision, to support, to sustain, to help manage the health system. But what happens at the patient health worker interface is a local matter. And there has to be devolution of autonomy there. This was proposed 20 years ago. They've been sitting on it, and I can understand why, because it means giving up control. Which bureaucrat do you know would voluntarily do that?
Dr. Aslam Dasoo, thank you, convener of the Progressive Health Forum. I do appreciate it. An important story.